Good evening and welcome to Psych Incubator and Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed. I am very pleased and honored to have Dr. Stephen Porges, the founder of polyvagal theory, here with us this evening. And Dr. Porges is a distinguished university scientist at Indiana University, where he is founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium within the Kinsey Institute. He holds a position of professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina and professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Maryland. Now, before we jump into this, about 10 years ago, actually in 2011, we started a journal. Jack Anch and Steve Sobelman and I started a journal called the Journal of Unified Psychotherapy and Clinical Science. And as part of the journal, we had a book review section. And we got a book to review called The Polyvagal Neurophysiological Foundations of Emotions, Attachment, Communication, Self-Regulation. And I was taken by this book and thought, wow, this is very interesting stuff. And at the time, I asked a colleague, Dr. Marilyn Sanders, who's a neonatologist at Children's Hospital in Hartford here, if she wanted to review the book, because there was a lot of physiology in it, and I really thought it would be interesting to have an MD. So Marilyn reviewed the book and wrote this beautiful book review that we published. And unfortunately, our journal, after four editions, kind of went out of business, but the book continued and continues to make have a big influence on the field. And Marilyn Sanders got so interested in polyvagal theory that she started to study it and write about it. And she wound up just publishing a book recently with co-author Dr. George Thompson called Polyvagal Theory in the Developing Child, Systems of Care for Strengthening Kids, Families, and Communities, which is an awesome book for anybody who's in the medical field, and I highly recommend it. So without further ado, I want to also introduce Michael Alpert and Kristin, for those of you who haven't been here before. And without further ado, we're going to take off. So let's go.
Well, good to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great to have you.
Yeah.
One thing that I was paying attention to in your bio is how many universities you are teaching at. And I'm curious to know, like, when you're teaching, what is the one thing that you hope all your students learn? If there had to be one.
That's actually a really good question. And I would say there are 2 points. One is individual differences, and the other one is maturational or developmental differences. And it's surprising how basically people tend to be blind to that. And you can see this in research where people think of individual differences as statistical error. And so part of my research journey was about mapping out what those individual differences were and could be measured and could be predictive of other behaviors. So, yeah. But let me also give another point. As an academic, academics are, in a sense, well, let me give you a little qualification here. I am part of a pair of academics. My wife is Sue Carter, and Sue's the person who discovered the relationship between oxytocin and social behavior. And so we've had, in a sense, parallel careers for decades. We've been married quite a long time. And we have 2 children, and one child is a faculty member at the University of Florida now in health psychology. So it's kind of interesting and doing extraordinarily. We're very proud of him. And the other one is a documentary filmmaker and journalist, and he's writing a book with me, a readable book on polyvagal theory. But the point I wanted to make is that when you have couples who share a goal in life of doing research and, in a sense, translating ideas into practice, you're always moving around to find workable positions because universities are really not designed, or they didn't evolve, let's use that word, for couples. And so we move for opportunity to do our work. Initially, it was opportunity just to have two jobs, and then it became opportunities to expand what we were doing.
Well, it sounds like you represent a group of people who have been essentially discriminated against. There should be a term for this. We should create a term called
Neuroception of danger.
no.
Well, you can't avoid.
It's them or something.
Well, I appreciate that, but again, we enter this world in a very pragmatic way, and I think part of our responsibility is to figure it out, to navigate. So I use terms like navigate through troubled waters or issues. So that was my role. I was, in a sense, the navigator. Now, it wasn't like I wanted to be the navigator. I'd love someone to just say, hey, Steve, come with me. I'll take good care of you. And in a way, I think that was in the back of our minds when we wanted to become academics. We thought, we'll find a home, we'll be like a family, and we'll dedicate ourselves to our work. And you start finding out that there are other vectors. So it is in a sense, what I want to say is that the academic world provides a lot of opportunity, but it may not be an easy world to navigate in. And
Sure.
And that's the bottom line. Is after 5 decades as a faculty member, it's like saying, yeah, it's tough, but there's a lot of benefits, and the ideas and the opportunities to discover enable you to do this other phase, which is part of my life now, and that is a translation of what I know into practice.
I'm so curious, like, as a couple in academia, like, what has been your driving passion together? Like what have you hoped to share and to develop? Like,
Want to know the secret? Nasal oxytocin.
You're pretty close.
Actually,
Pretty close. Sue takes credit for my interest in social behavior, which has become my dominant theme, or sociality now. And Sue's, I would say, input is that the human organism is not a single. It's part of a. We study human behavior in psychological labs as individuals, when in reality we don't function well at all as individuals.
Yeah, we're relational.
That's right. And so the common theme was in our lives, and this is coming from my mouth, was how could we have opportunities that enabled each of us to develop our own portfolio, our own life. The interesting part, and I often will say this at talks, is that we had totally independent research trajectories or profiles for the first 20 years of the marriage. And then the term I use is we became reacquainted in the brainstem and found out that the structures that were involved in autonomic regulation were hotspots for oxytocin. So suddenly it became a more common theme. And we played around with giving joint talks for a while, and even with the idea of writing a book called The Neural Love Code.
Well, she pioneered her work on voles, right? Like
yeah.
prairie voles.
Yeah, exactly. But voles are interesting because they're like mice, they're small rodents, but they bond for life. And they do alloparenting, and they have community behavior. But what makes them unique in her world is that they have extremely high levels of oxytocin relative to the solitary species of vole. But from my perspective, what makes them interesting is they have human-like levels of vagal regulation of their heart. And so it's not like you get one without the other. And that was really kind of an interesting. We shared a postdoc for several years, and we did some studies on autonomics in the voles. And in a sense, you could see if you, quote, stress or distress a vole through isolation, their autonomic nervous system changes and their oxytocin levels change. So the point is you start seeing the parallel of these systems.
what happens if you make them happy?
Yeah. You see that's a psychiatrist talking, right? In terms I would say in my terminology, what happens when you make them feel safe? And then you start getting the
Sure, when you make-
expression of
fair enough.
social.
Yeah, when you make them feel safe, comfortable, understood.
Yeah, then sociality becomes the emergent property. And this is really, I would say, our evolutionary heritage as social mammals. We're social beings. We're emergently that way. We interact, we seek it, if and only if our autonomic nervous system is not in a state of defense, meaning that we're not dealing with threat.
You know, this is fascinating because I saw Jacques Panksepp present in 2010 in Vancouver and just fell in love with his work with, you know, laughing rats. And
Yes.
and for me as a clinician who also does some research, but mostly a clinician, it was the invitation to bring like play and humor into the psychotherapy office.
Yeah.
And that's all I needed was Jack Panksepp saying thumbs up. And then I was off and going, and it really changed my work in a positive way.
Yeah. Well, he's sorely missed. You know, we were good friends. I think we were on the circuit together. Shared not the podium, but the table several times. But what I see, I'm also a big advocate of play, but I see it from a different perspective. I see it as the principles of play are reciprocity, co-regulation. And so many of the features of play are the features of therapy.
Yeah.
So I see playfulness and attentiveness to other and role reversal, which is part of play, as really the basic principles of neural exercises that result in resilience or sociality.
Well, you know, I would love to watch you and your wife watch the Netflix film called Masters and Johnson. Have the two of you watched it together?
But we had but we had dinner with Masters and Johnson.
You did not. Okay.
Yeah, in the 70s.
Wow.
Really? What was that like? Yeah, bring us there. We want a picture.
Well, it's interesting
not want
because it was interesting. Because one of the collaborators from Washington University, was now at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, where we were. And he was a real good friend, and his wife was a real good friend of ours. And so they invited us. So actually, more than that, he invited Masters and Johnson to teach in Sue's course. And she was teaching human sexuality, a course for the medical students that were in Champaign. And he said, "Don't worry, I'll just call them up and they'll come. They owe me a favor." And it was very interesting, but we learned a lot about their history as well. And if I have it right, and it's been many years, is that Virginia Johnson, got it right. I believe came from the same area of Southwest Missouri, not Missouri, but Missouri, where Sue came from. So they had things in common. But the take home that I will mention that you will all remember is how Bill Masters made money when he was poor and going to medical school or trying to get going. He flew brand new airplanes to put miles on them, and then they could sell them for more money.
Oh my God.
Because airplanes were not the safest things if they had no miles on it. So that I found, I never forgot that.
Right.
So I want to bring it back a second to, or more than a second. So Steve, for those of in our audience who maybe not be familiar with polyvagal theory, and probably most people are, but if you could put it into the most simplistic terms for me and for the audience, like what is polyvagal theory, and then we'll talk about how it can be used in medical application.
Polyvagal theory really emphasizes that the individual's physiological state is a powerful mediator of how they relate to the world. So if your body's in a state of calmness, then the world seems more positive and you're more perceptive of other people's
is that what you call social engagement?
Yeah, it becomes accessible.
Okay.
social engagement, your own social engagement system becomes accessible. You can, in a sense,
You get
broadcast.
safe and relaxed to
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So if your body's tense and your voice is squeaky, you're conveying something to someone
Yeah.
else,
Okay.
and their nervous system detects that, and their body reacts. And so it becomes,
It's contagious. Like
it's reactive. You could say it's contagious.
How
That
does
would be.
do
Okay.
you know how it works? How does it work?
It works. It's very predictable, but I have to get two other points in before I can. So the physiological states that we have are relatively turnkey, meaning that they're a newer state that, in a sense, restrains or contains us to be calm and to be social. And we can use that system even when we're mobilized, and that becomes play. But if we pull that system, that newer system off, that play becomes aggression. It's the same mobilization without this social overlay or social engagement system. And underneath that, if aggression and mobilization doesn't get you to a safe state, there's a very, very primitive system that shuts you down. You shut down and pass out, defecate, and it's potentially dangerous because you're not getting enough oxygen to the brain. And so the nervous system is very smart. So if that happens under severe abuse or trauma, the next time that happens, you may just freeze or dissociate. So the body makes an adjustment so that you don't, in a sense, die through that reflexive activity. But these major states have certain adaptive features. But if that social engagement state, which is this newer vagal calming system, intertwines, or let's say becomes a hybrid state with mobilization, it's play. And if it becomes intertwined with immobilization, it's intimacy. So in fact, when we use terms like foreplay, what are we talking about? We're using vocalizations, gestures, and immobilization. So the body, we have a language. And the idea is that if we as social mammals immobilize, we can become more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And therefore we need to be very conscious or vigilant. And when we want to turn that vigilance off, we turn it off with that social engagement system. And this is functionally why people who have suffered severe trauma and abuse, frequently that trauma and abuse is caused by someone that they had trusted. Their bodies now get retuned. And now when someone speaks nicely or sweetly to them, comes in their proximity, rather than saying, oh, give me a hug, their bodies go like this and say, get me out of there. So right. Cues of safety now get reinterpreted as cues of threat. And so you can see that. Now, if you have this polyvagal perspective, and this is Jeffrey's point, then none of the stuff makes sense. It doesn't, let's say, how in the world, someone's being nice to you, why don't you give them a hug back? They're talking to you nicely. Why are you dissociating? Pay attention. All these types of things that we think that our behaviors are really intentional. Polyvagal theory basically tells us that under many situations, our behaviors are not intentional. They're survival oriented. And when they hit survival level, all bets are off for intentionality.
And I think it's so important that therapists that are in training learn about your theories so that they can begin to regulate how they're intervening. Yeah. And, when I'm working with therapists, when they're saying to a patient, you can trust me, right?
That's a seducer, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they're shocked when I'm saying you've just stepped into the role of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
That is a classic perpetrator statement to say, and please don't. And boy, do I
what I say is I need to earn your trust, and I earn it through my behavior. And I was working on this today with someone that navigating that intrasubjective space, boundaries, is what makes people feel safe when you're cueing into, oh boy, that doesn't feel right when you did that. So
Jeffrey, let me stop on your words for a moment. And that is, it has a lot to do with the intonation of the voice. It has less to do with the words. So even though you were emphasizing the words, your voice has good prosody and you're a gentle person and gentle soul. It comes through. But the words are not the important vehicle.
Right.
The intonation of our voice is the important vehicle. Our gestures are. That's what therapists need to learn. And by the way, even healthcare professionals who are not therapists, like physicians, need to understand that they are projecting either cues of safety or cues of threat, or which are often like disinterest or arrogance or whatever it is, but it's not connection. And so people, in a sense, under those settings, can't even process the medical advice they're getting.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a scary place to be anyway.
So true. Yeah. And I mean, the power of the voice. I mean, all of us should be receiving training about how to use our voices, when to use them, because it's such a vital part of healing.
Of connecting, and connecting enables healing. That's the point I really want to bring home. So coming back to your guests.
Yeah, I just want to say, I don't think that you have to be trained to use your voice. I think you have to pay attention to how your voice changes as you feel different things. And that's what's going to be heard by the people you're working with. So as I talk and I hear the story of somebody who's upset and I hurt hearing it, the voice actually drops because there's more lubrication of my larynx by the autonomically controlled glands on the side, so my voice drops. That sound is soothing for most people. I'm not doing it because I'm trying to do it. I'm doing it because I'm paying attention to my emotional state and allowing myself to feel with them. So it's kind of like riding a roller coaster and being aware of what you're affecting.
Let me feed into that, because your laryngeal and pharyngeal nerves, which is what you're talking about, are vagal nerves. They are paralleling the vagal regulation of your heart. And so when you have those prosodic, warm, inviting voice, it's really reflecting that your heart is, we use the term, your heart is open, but it means that you have ventral vagal influence on the heart, and you have these oscillatory sinus arrhythmia patterns coming through, because the evolution of sociality in mammals was really through the broadcasting of our physiological state to another, because mammals other than humans don't have language. So it wasn't words, it was the intonation of their vocalizations and their posture and their facial expressions that cued the other whether they were safe to come close to.
Well, wow. It would be so fascinating to study therapists who are doing their own work and to watch like how they change in terms of their tone of voice and their ability to regulate as their hearts open through the process of healing.
So what you'd be doing is, since you're in your mind, you're creating this animation that our hearts open and we can hear it in the voice. And, these are all metaphors, but there's actually a physiology behind it. The part, and actually, since you're all, the three of you are trained and licensed, I presume, therapists, and I'm not, I've always been very concerned about the notion of manualization of training for therapists, and really start to think about that. Again, this is over the years that you find people who are super master therapists. And in my world, I would call them super co-regulators. And it doesn't matter what they are trained in. It's just that they have, quote, the knack.
Yeah, what's one of the things I almost always ask our eminent therapist about, is it the therapist or is it the approach and the manual? And I would totally agree that there are, part of the variance is the approach, but I would say a larger part of it is the characteristics of the therapist, and there's a lot that goes into that, whether we're born with that or whether that can be trained. I always ask the therapist, can you train people to do that or not? And we get into a discussion about that.
Favorite question.
You can train them, or you can subject them to something that causes them to rely more on their autonomic nervous systems, and then they will become better therapists, is what I would say.
Well, I think what we're talking about, the master therapist, is really the first step of doing great therapy, and that those are the people who are able to connect with their client. Now, once you connect with the client and you create that dyad, that reciprocal dyad, then I think a knowledge-based approach becomes useful.
Yeah.
And so I think that's when the
Yes.
manual can be helpful.
Yes, but the engagement process is
Yeah.
what you're talking about is
Mm,
clearly, especially in the more traumatized people that we work with, is certainly the challenge, and that's what I think frustrates a lot of
Mhm.
early career therapists, that they're doing their approach,
Yeah.
but you can do whatever approach you do if you can't engage that person, and that could be. Sometimes that starts out like, as you were saying, play. Like, just if
Yeah.
you can get someone to play and have some of that synchrony, then you're going somewhere. Without that, it's very difficult to get. Like, I had a patient who was seeing a therapist. He said she wanted me to go home and do all this homework, and I didn't do it, and I stopped doing it, and I stopped going. And this was a woman that had witnessed the Twin Towers fall down, and no one ever talked to her about that.
right. Right.
So yeah, it is a complicated and fascinating challenge that we have. How do we train therapists to do effective work?
Yeah.
And I think the polyvagal theory gives us a roadmap in a way that's very helpful.
I think that actually it not only gives you a roadmap into how to get started with the patient or client or whatever you want to call it, but it teaches you how to treat the patient when you're treating the patient, because actually I think the thing that is most curative for most patients, which allows them to drop whatever defensive maneuvers they're using to protect themselves, is teaching them to look at themselves in their traumatized early state and how you feel seeing that. And if you get them, they automatically empathize with this kid. They understand this kid.
Mhm.
This caring about the kid is felt by the kid, and suddenly the wounded part of them feels better.
Yeah.
And when that happens, it makes the caring part feel better. And you get this social, this link up and back, up and back. And the more times that happens, the more the symptoms melt away.
Well, I'm going to break this all up, because who's training the therapist really matters too. I mean, we have to be aware of like our own attachment system and what's happening there, and really be doing our own work, in order to even use this theory with training therapists,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because I mean, therapists, when they're in training, are experiencing high levels of anxiety, and they are having, they're moving into their defenses, and you really have to be able to kind of watch and see the therapist and figure out how to work with them so that they can learn about their own selves, and then bring that to like working with the patient. So it's,
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good point, because my youngest daughter just
I'm exhausted.
started her first job as a a social worker in a hospital that works with severely mentally ill patients. And she said to me, "Dad, I have to start going to meet with these schizophrenic patients, and I'm scared." I said, "That's normal, it's normal to be scared."
Yeah. Well, I'm going to break that down for you in a polyvagal terminology. She's telling you that uncertainty is threatening, and uncertainty to our nervous system is a threat. And this is the difference between threats and play, because a lot of play or humor is uncertainty within a safe place. Like peekaboo, it becomes the basis of humor. Humor becomes funny when it violates our expectancy, but it violates it in a safe place.
Yeah.
And so for your daughter, an understanding of being in a safe place for that exposure changes from threat to curiosity. And I, by the way, I had the same types of feelings about dissociative people until I started to understand it as an adaptive adjustment.
Yes.
And then I start to see it as literally honoring the nuances of how dissociation works as it tries to help the individual navigate to survival. And what I'm saying is that when we start talking about our own body's adjustments, not with shame or blame, but with honor and awe, literally, I think the movement forward becomes easier. And I think in mental health, especially when people start experiencing some of the things that we're talking about, is people are embarrassed. They don't want to share it. And the issue is the reframing of it is about the really how wonderful your nervous system has been to enable you to adjust and to survive with this. Mm-hmm. Now it's time, you don't need those defenses anymore. This is what Michael is saying, that it's a knowledge that we feel the body, we understand it. And what you were describing, Michael, is what I call neural exercises, where we move back and forth between states. And they lose their valence. They become just a different state. I can move there, I can move to this, I can immobilize, I can mobilize, and I can still smile.
So would you call that fluid state shifts?
That's a nice terminology, fluidity among that, as opposed to being locked in a state.
Yes,
And what you're seeing, I believe, in much of the clinical consultation is people locked in states, and they can't live a good life. No. I'm now moving into learning more about the world of addiction, which is very close to saying, if you're locked in states, how do you get out of it? And unfortunately, people try to use substances or behaviors, addictive behaviors, to get out of those states. So they get into more mobilized states and not social states.
That's right.
Well, I've been really leaning into this book called Tribe by Sebastian Jung. Have you read that?
I haven't read it, no.
Yeah, so I mean, it's about tribes. It's about how people come together and why. And I've been integrating it into my work, especially with COVID, with the idea of like, how can people build like a support team around themselves?
Yeah.
That's made of, all sorts of different people.
So let's stick with that for a moment, because I'm getting a lot of input or interest in the medical community since you brought up COVID, and that is medical staff are being burnt out. They're angry. There's despair. There's suicidal
right.
thought. Yeah, it's horrible because they feel marginalized. They don't feel they have any agency, and they don't have opportunities to co-regulate. And the normal history of work environments, including in hospitals and medical centers, is you have a break room, you have a social relationship, and that's not what has happened during COVID. So the normal calming down they're not having that opportunity through the mechanisms of social engagement. And I wrote an editorial for a psychiatry journal, and it was about the paradoxical impact of COVID on our nervous system. One, COVID is a threat. So obviously our nervous system is now more into defense mode, which, by the way, isn't good in dealing with the virus. It basically ramps it up.
Weakens your immune system.
Yeah. And the second point is to the history of humanity. What was the go-to mechanism to downregulate threat responses? Social interaction. Suddenly that's taken away. So our nervous system is in this quandary. We want to be hugged, we want to engage, we want to meet new people, we want to travel. And those become risks. So we retune. And what do we retune when I use that term? We retune our autonomic nervous system. And now we're locked, many of us are locked into a state of constant threat or chronic threat. And this gets manifested in irritability, hypervigilance, relationship problems. And remember, most or many, let's say many families are not happy families to start with.
Yeah. And
many families are dangerous for kids. Yeah. And now they're being forced to spend time together in environments that they tolerated when they had much more flexibility.
Yeah, I was in the airport recently, and exactly what you were talking about, I experienced. My wife and I were sitting there, and there's a guy sitting across from us with his mask like this, And we both felt ourselves like starting to get really irritable, like, oh my God, this guy's a threat. Like,
Yeah.
pull your
Well,
mask up, buddy.
Yeah, move to Florida and walk down the streets.
Well, that's where we were, Florida.
I just left Florida and I can't believe I made it out alive.
Yeah.
That way, as soon as you get south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah.
No.
You know, I'm not going there. It's
So,
like,
so for the therapists that are watching,
yeah.
how would you say how would you suggest using polyvagal theory in the therapeutic space?
Okay, let's bring one other concept on board. And that's the concept of neuroception. And neuroception is our nervous system's detection of risk or safety without awareness. So things happen and we don't know they're happening, although we often have bodily feelings. So if someone, in a sense, is cueing us, or the environment cues us and we feel basically unsafe, we'll feel that, but we won't know where the cues came from. And that means we might attack the person across the table from us and accuse them of creating the problem when that person is just neutral at worst and just doesn't know what's going on. So the first thing is this awareness of a nervous system that is always surveying the cues of safety or threat. And what the pandemic has done, it's biased it way to the threat side. But the cues of safety are intonation, facial expressivity, the things we mentioned, because they trigger that newer mammalian social engagement system that has that newer vagal pathway that calms us down. But mammals have this unique system that reflexively puts us into states of safety, turns off threat, like the crying baby stops crying when the mother engages and uses a prosodic voice. The uncomfortable dog calms down when the owner, or let's say parent, or whatever we want to call them now, starts talking in a prosodic voice, and the dog goes on the back. It shows ventral side, not submissiveness, but accessibility, something very different, and asking to be rubbed. And so we can see that cues of safety. Mammals are different than other preceding vertebrate, like reptiles, amphibia, and virtually all living systems, including plants, have a type of neuroception that detects threat. But mammals have something that turns off threat. And that enabled humanity to evolve, to cooperate, to survive, and in a sense, to turn off threat reactions. And it's the basis of our civilization, is the ability to turn off our threat reactions.
Well, and this is why journaling is so important. Listening to your dreams, paying attention to your intuition, cultivating like self-compassion, self-acceptance, self-love, self-protection, because if you could kind of activate all of these things and move, you have to exercise, then you can become more aware of what's happening unconsciously. And that's what I've learned the most from your work, is like, how do I begin to allow the unconscious to become conscious, so that I'm aware that when this type of person walks into the room, my system is going to react in this way, and I can choose to do something about that, versus just having my system in charge of me.
It's like, maybe I need to get up and walk around the room a bit, or take a deep breath. It's
more
important.
than that. It's like a victory pose.
The important part, another important point you brought up, is basically the portal of entry for yourself and for your clients might require some movement, because you and your client may not be able to sit still. You may be under, instance, too many threat cues for your social engagement system to literally constrain your need to mobilize. But if you move and smile and are playful, the systems start to come more into sync. It took me decades to see that latter point, because I had, in my mind, thought that everything's about a face-to-face interaction, literally almost a psychotherapeutic model of sitting across or behind, whatever works. But the issue is that it was an engagement model. And I was not respectful that not everyone can sit still. And I started to learn that dance movement therapies are ways of getting into that system And what you start seeing is that people, if they're moving a little, they can start smiling and they can start engaging each other. And I think that I would say that in probably the next few years, movement will be integrated more and more into psychotherapy. So it won't be dance movement therapy, it'll be psychotherapy that has some movement in it.
I agree with you 100% because I know with COVID, I had to move some of my sessions to a picnic table
Yeah.
or here in San Diego to a walk on the beach.
Yeah.
And I actually was trained in dance movement therapy, like, 25 plus years ago. And so it really helped me to use like object relations theory so that I knew what I was up to when I was moving things out of the office. But we also have out here surf therapy that's taking off. And I think more therapists due to COVID are doing walks and talks and it might even be like on their phone instead of doing Zoom, where everyone's getting that kind of Zoom fog. Perhaps they're just like putting their headsets on and taking a walk together. So I'm thrilled to hear you say that because I believe it's happening too. I think it's there's a shift happening in our world.
I see it as a portal of entry.
Yeah, I like that. We're in the portal.
Yeah, and basically, people have different ranges in which you can enter, and some people you have to have some movement with it. So I think you're right on target.
Well, I know that, in our personal lives, when let's say we have to go to a family event and there's high anxiety, the family members that are able to take a walk after dinner, it's brilliant because it helps everyone kind of regulate themselves and be in conversation with one another and for like a really positive exchange to happen. Whereas if everyone's just in the house post dinner, that's when things can really get going. So yeah, lovely.
So you were talking earlier about the hotspots for the vagus and the autonomic nervous system in the brainstem. I wondered if you could expand on those hotspots and talk about their importance.
Okay, so there's actually a kind of interesting narrative because it becomes an interesting story that is about how our anatomy, our neuroanatomy changed with evolution. So there is an area of the brainstem called the dorsal motor nucleus, which was for virtually all vertebrates, it's the sole vagal nucleus. It's called dorsal, of course, it's in the back of the brainstem. What happens in the transition from reptiles to mammals is that the primary cardio-inhibitory fibers, the parts that slow heart rate and calm us down, went for a little journey. They went for a walk. And that little journey led them to an area of the brainstem that is now called the ventral vagal complex. But it's an area of the brainstem that regulates the striated muscles of the face and head, our larynx, our pharynx, the facial nerve, the trigeminal nerve. They're basically the nerves that regulate the structures that evolved from the ancient gill arches. So it's like in controlling breath, vocalization, ingestion. And that they became intertwined with that cardio-inhibitory vagus. So ingestive behaviors became calming, sucking behaviors became calming, vocalizations became calming, listening using neuroregulation of the muscles of the middle ear, because if we wanted to pull in human voice or melody, we had to tense those muscles. That became calming as well. So our civilization basically evolved from this social engagement system and its linkage with the vagus to calm us. So we not only were able to calm, but we were able to project that calming to others. And in projecting the calming to others, it calmed them.
Wow.
And so you can start seeing this synergistic dialogue going on, like vocalizations reflect my physiological state, but in listening to them, they're calming you down. And now your voice reflects it. And suddenly we start seeing elements of therapeutic relationships, and they are cues of safety. And the actual element is not just the cues of safety, it's feeling safe. What does feeling safe mean? And again, we need to deconstruct our language because we are so messed up. We think safety is removal of threat, just like we think that if we take away stress, everything's fine. It's not. We miss the point. The point is threat isn't good, but our bodies need something else. We need cues of safety. Stress isn't good, but removal of it needs a body that supports homeostatic processes. So I would operationalize, throw out some of these words and say that stress is threat and they are disruptors of homeostasis. So your positive statements, feeling safe and being in a state of safety, is supporting homeostasis. So why don't we look at homeostatic functions? And that's where heart rate variability becomes our window to that system. So we can operationalize without getting lost in psychological constructs. And I would say the neurophysiologists and the comparative neuroanatomists haven't helped us. So like we talk about a stress axis. It's not a stress axis. It's an axis that supports energy mobilization and which has a function. Stress is something else. Then we get caught up into good stress and bad stress rather than saying stress that we recover from is a neural exercise. Stress that we don't recover from is bad. What's the major feature is duration of the stressor.
Let me ask you a question related to that. It has to do with, what about context?
Yeah.
For instance, if I, see my child,
Mm-hmm.
and I just feel, especially thinking of her as a baby or a toddler or something, and I just feel such tightness in my chest and a feeling of warmth, and I just want to just hug her and
Mm-hmm.
just take care of her, and it's a lot of tightness beneath the sternum in the mediastinum. It's this wonderful feeling. Now, and I love it. Now, on the other hand, if my mother dies, and I've had a lot of this lately because she's 101 and not very well, so I have a lot of warning signs. And the thought of this causes, again, a terrible tightness, same place, but now it's awful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's obviously my connection with the child or my mother caused this tight feeling, and forming it is the same feeling as losing it. It's the context that seems to make me happy or sad about it.
Well, in polyvagal theory, context drives neuroception. So it is the driving context and cues. So it's cues, basically context is these external cues that our body's reacting to. But the negativity, or let's say the negative feelings that you have, are what I am intuiting is that there's a vasoconstriction going on. The body is getting into this a very high sympathetic tension.
Sure.
And in a sense, it can become, in a sense, cardiovascularly challenging.
Sure.
Versus, in a sense, feeling, which is a warmer feeling, is when you're thinking about hugging your child. So you may have the tension in the skeletal muscles, the intercostals, maybe like that, but the vascular bed is going to be very different. So there may be,
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about the guys that I work with and the words that I can use with them, right? Mm-hmm. and as I'm listening to both of you, first of all, if there's any way that you could be in New York City and go to Dr. Alpert's office, you will see that there are like 2 video cameras, one on him, one on the patient, 2 sets of TVs, and he's actually encouraging the patient to look at themselves in the TV screen and have compassion for themselves. And sometimes he does it for himself too. Yeah. And so, everything that you're talking about is almost like this perfect fit for Dr. Alpert's clinical work. But I'm also thinking about like Ed Tronick with the power of discord. And that's what, I'm really kind of thinking of is like how important it is to help our patients feel empowered when they are in the midst of discord and they are successfully navigating it. you know, and I think we have a tendency to like pathologize like what's not working well, you know, how did they screw up?
Yeah.
You know, how did the past victimize them
Mhm.
versus like looking at how well they're doing and how impressive it is. And there's almost like this, like if you can combine like you know, I'm thinking this like empowered validation with the soothing awareness of what's happening inside. It's really like a perfect like mixture.
Well, you know, I'm listening to this concept of what, since there's another embedded concept there, and that is self-agency, and the notion, the dialogue I get into frequently is stop thinking about fixing things,
Right.
and start allowing a person to express their feelings, give them support. And it's, I mean, it
is what it is.
Well, I always kind of like my interpretation of Buddhism. And again, I got to be careful. I don't mean to be. I basically say that bad things happen. You know, and our job
they are happening.
And our job is not to fix it. Our job is to witness it and enable the other to feel that we're there. And the notion that I feel your pain and I'm going to fix it, or I'm going to throw those people into prison. I think the trauma world has taught me so much, because those who have been so severely abused are not really concerned about retribution. They want their voice to be heard. They want to have presence. They want to be real again. It's not that they want to punish other. They may want to, but that's not the highest priority. The highest priority is for them to feel real, to be listened to be heard. Their voice was taken from them. And I think the culture is so much, in a sense, our medical worldview is if there's something wrong, take a pill, you know, or get a surgery, we'll fix it. As opposed to, you know, your body is this wealth of self-healing properties, and your mental health also has self-healing properties. And if you honor that and you respect what it's done, rather than calling it pathology, you say, this has enabled me to survive, then rather than shame, it becomes this degree of pride in what my nervous system has done for me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm getting chills listening to you, and I'm just remembering Maya Angelou's book, you know, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And that's what it's all about, is putting, being able to express. Yeah. With the encouragement of our attuned therapist. Thinking of you, Dr. Alpert.
Well, no, just actually, I appreciate that, but hearing Stephen talk about things makes me cavell, if you know the truth. So you know, this
it's not it's a different type of tightening.
I mean,
it's lovely.
He's putting into words what I've seen you do on stage with your patients over and over and over again. And it's really amazing to just see the two of you together right now.
Thank you. So, you know, the notion is you carry the insights in your practice. And what you're telling me is that you, in using the videos, you're seeing the physiological states being broadcast, and you're using it in a psychoeducational way where the people become more reconnected. The term I now use about that is they become more embodied. So the higher brain structures are now learning about the lower brain structures, regulation of the body. So it's a connection is occurring. They're co-regulating on an internal level.
Yeah, we've had the privilege of training with Habib Davanloo for all kinds of interesting reasons, and what we took with that I think has been helpful to many of us. But one of the things that I learned from that experience was he taught us to be exquisitely attuned to the physiology of the patient, where the channeling of the anxiety is, to the striated muscles, all the stuff that you're talking about, to just because that moment by moment attunement tells everything. It's not
Yeah.
the words, as you were saying before, it's that moment by moment tuning in. And I think expert master therapists just have fine-tuned that ability to notice those subtle changes in facial expressions, prosody, muscle tension, with all those signs. And so that's an important part of our training and what you endorse in your polyvagal theory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. So not what I view my role in life as a deconstructor. So you're basically describing what you do, and in a sense, it lines up very nicely with how I deconstruct these systems.
Yes.
And in deconstructing, it gives you a different language. It gives you a language that it has a different, I would say, concrete relationship with neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and evolutionary history.
So in the last 5 minutes before we stop recording, and we will continue for those of you watching. We're going to stop recording at 7, but we'll continue and we'll take questions that you can submit through chat. But I was wondering what you think. How do you think the future of psychotherapy could benefit from using physiological measurements in the course of the therapeutic process?
Well, this is interesting because if we go back to when I started my academic career, that was really one of my interests. I never lost that interest in a sense, and that was the idea of, and then later I wrote a paper, and there's a section of the paper called Unveiling Darwin. It was the idea that if you take the skin off, you can see the neuromuscular regulation of emotions, and that gives you hints about where it's going, what's going on in the brainstem. So I think, well, I'll also give you another story. So when I was a faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Illinois Medical School in Chicago, I gave a lecture to the fourth year residents.
Yeah.
I mean, 4 years out is pretty long. And the title of the talk was, why should I look at people's faces? Or what?
No.
And the one of the guys came in, one of the fellows, and he says, "Why am I even in this room?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I was told not to look at my clients."
Yeah, psychoanalytic rates.
He said, I said, what do you mean? He said, "Well, I was told that if I take the clipboard, turn my head sideways, tilt my eyes upward, that the client would think that I am contemplating or thinking about the client." I said, "Keep talking to me." He couldn't get a word out because once I turned away and tilted upward, it was totally disconnect. It was interesting. He still keeps in touch with me. He got very, very bonded.
He saved his life. You know, I was a resident in psychoanalysis. We were all in analysis, and I would be on the couch, and the analyst was sitting behind me, and he would say a word here and there, maybe. And after about a year, I gave up, and I realized that a friend of mine was in the next office. And so we tapped on the wall in Morse code and had a conversation.
So my interpretation of what happens when someone sits behind you doing analysis is that you automatically go into a state of threat, and you get anxious, and you start talking because that's you say anything. And it's to, in a sense, express yourself.
Right.
And I think the fallacy was to believe that the words had meaning as opposed to an emotional expression.
And on that note, we're going to have to wrap for today in our recording. Dr. Porges,
thank you so much. It was great.
It's been a pleasure, and we hope to have you back soon. And we're gonna hang around and do a wrap up. So those of you who are watching, if you want to submit some questions or comments while we do that, please do. And we will stop the recording now and hope you all come back next month. Thank you. All right.